Hello and welcome to this CQFA webinar on cold temperature RPAS operations. My name is Jean Laroche. I'm Director of Research and Development at CQFA. For this webinar, I was with Toronto-based RPAS operator Stephen Sweeting of DroneVue Imaging, who briefed us about two winter missions he conducted in northern Quebec. Here's Stephen.
My name is Stephen, and I am the owner-operator of DroneVue Imaging. It's a Toronto-based drone company. It's one of several businesses that I have. It's not the one that produces the most revenue at this point, let's say. But I focus primarily at this point on documentary films. I've been working with a documentary filmmaker, doing quite a bit of work for him. So it would be a combination of both video and still images that I do. And I've done work for municipalities and some golf course archaeological related imaging also. We're basically going to have a look at an operation that I did at the back end of 2017 into early 2018. The first thing that we're going to start on is just giving you some background to the operation, give you an idea of what it was I was about to do and where I was going to go, just to give you some dimension to this. As someone from Toronto, I'm not used to extreme cold weather operations. Obviously, it's been a little bit on the cool and icy side the last few days. Most of the time, we don't get the same sort of weather that you get here in Montreal and certainly in further north Quebec. So the first thing I'm going to do is background to the operation. And I'm going to essentially lead you through my thought process and my research process, and then the actual pulling together of bits and pieces and elements that were incorporated into the operation, and then actually into the actual operation. So I'm going to start with key issues to consider, move through to my approach to cold weather planning, and then I'm going to go on to additional planning steps after that. Beyond that, we're going to continue with the cold weather equipment list that I built up. In essence, a lot of research and a lot of planning involved and seeking out and drawing together equipment. So I want to run through the list that the equipment that I actually used in these two operations. Next, I want to go through to the actual flight operation that took place in December, and I'll give you a bit of a brief description of what actually happened, and then we'll move through to a post-operation appraisal, I'll call it, or an evaluation to tell you what I thought was successful, what I thought was unsuccessful. Because this is a two-part operation, we're going to leap forward in time from December to February, which was the second part of the operation. So I'm going to run through the planning that I went through for the second part, and then I'm going to give you a brief overview of what actually happened, and then we're going to do, again, a post-operation appraisal. What was successful, what was unsuccessful, what I might want to do in the future. Future modifications, I call that. And then we'll finalize with some conclusions that I've made. These are very general, and I hopefully you will make some comments and think about what I said.
Now, that was related to a mission you had in mid-northern Quebec, right?
It was. Yeah, the actual mission was for, ultimately was for a company called Osisko Mining Incorporated. You can see actually a still shot from some video. This particular location it's about, I would say, 250 kilometers north and east of Val d'Or. So that will give you some sort of an idea of where it is. More specifically, it's about maybe 150 kilometers to the east of La Belle-Sacavillon. Accessible by some roads they're forestry roads, but we actually went in by air on the first time, by a combination of aircraft flying to La Belle-Sacavillon and helicopter. The second time we went in, unfortunately, we didn't have the pleasure of helicoptering in. We did about a 2-hour drive down logging roads, which were very well maintained. I was surprised how well maintained they were. All right, let's start now with some background about this operation. So this was a film project that was being done for a gold exploration camp in northern Quebec, as I've indicated. This is an existing mine that has some new drilling going on for underground excavations. This is a very large level concern. In fact, I was surprised at how big it was. They, in fact, have about between 300 and 400 people that are working up there at the moment. They've got about 45 drilling rigs that are running. At any time, there'll be about 25 of them running 24 hours a day. So these people will fly up there or or actually get up by bus, and then they'll work 2 weeks straight, 12-hour shifts, and they're doing a combination of the actual drilling, and these would be the people who are essentially the drilling technicians or workers, but there's also a large staff of geologists there who were looking at core samples that are coming out of the ground and doing the analysis. The idea of this is obviously they're trying to find where new gold is. Existing operation was there a number of years ago. This is not a mine shaft going into the ground. This is a portal. So it's a long incline into the ground, goes in to about a depth of about 150 meters, so quite deep.
Like a ramp?
It is. A ramp is, yes, there's a long incline ramp, and then equipment would roll into the mine. And in fact, we did get a chance to go into the mine, which was great. I'd never been in one before. And it was completely dark. Any lighting at all that you bring in to the mine is what you light. So you've got obviously your helmet, and you've got lighting on the vehicles that you're working on. They're working 24 hours a day, as I mentioned. To give you an idea of the scale of this, a normal drilling operation will run about 5 rigs at any given time. This operation is currently running 25 at any given time. So it's a very large scale operation going on.
And as a drone operator, were you hired by the mine itself?
This was indirectly by the mine. It was through a filmmaker that I work with, and he was working for a production and PR company. So I was a couple of levels down in the actual hiring. I worked with this particular filmmaker quite a bit. In fact, I've done some work with him, for instance, with the, perhaps some of you may know about the Avro Arrow recovery project. There are some models that were launched out into Lake Ontario in 1959 to flight test the shape of the Avro Arrow. Those are being recovered, taken out of the water, and I was involved with my colleague in actually doing film of the archaeologists, aerials of what they were doing. Let's divert back, however, to where we were in Quebec. So just to give you some idea of what this actually looks like, vast flat terrain generally. There's not a lot of hills. It's pretty much made up of peat bogs, lakes, and spruce forests. I only ever saw it with snow on the ground. I haven't really seen any images of it without, but it's a very flat, high terrain. They call it the Abitibi Uplands, and it is an area that has a central mining exploration camp, and then it's surrounded by some outbuildings and roads to the various drilling rigs, and also roads to the actual portal that I explained earlier. It was to be a 2-stage project. The first part of it was in December, only a half day, very short, and I'll explain why a little bit later. The second part, and we didn't know exactly when this was going to happen, was in February, and that lasted 3 days. In both of these instances, the client determined the dates. I had no input on that. So what I want to run through with you now is some of the key issues to consider when you're doing a cold weather operation, and specifically I'm demonstrating this through the particular operation that I did. So obviously the equipment that you're using is incredibly important. Obviously the UAS, the drone that you're using. In my particular instance, it was a DJI Inspire 1 V2. Many of you will be familiar with that. The reason I chose this particular aircraft was that it was operational at a slightly lower temperature than some of the other drones that I have. In fact, the minimum recommended operating temperature for this particular drone is about minus 10 Celsius. Now, it's a rather interesting conundrum the way that it's worded, because it doesn't really say that you can't operate the drone below that level. It's just suggesting that this is the temperature. And obviously you're being guided by the terms of your SFOC, so you wouldn't want to push it too far. You'll see this happening. For instance, there was one day that was really just too cold to operate.
Now, the date was determined quite a bit in advance, so actual weather forecast would not have been preventing you to go there, I guess. Huh? You had to live with the weather that you had.
Pretty much. We really had to, we were along for the ride, essentially, in this particular instance. And the conditions were something that we didn't control. As any of you know who have done operations, you're always watching the weather for the days that are approaching the operation, and you're hoping it's not going to rain or you're not going to have freezing temperatures. But there are some efforts that you can make in advance, obviously with a cold weather operation, to ascertain what sort of conditions you might be dealing with.
Now, this is sparsely settled area, northern Quebec. Did you use Google Maps? Were they accurate? How did you feel about your readiness level?
Well, the readiness, that's a great question, John, because obviously, like any operator, I looked in advance and I planned my mission as best I could. Because I also had access to some of the mining companies' maps, I quickly realized that outside of the actual mining camp area, over by the drilling rigs and also over by the actual portal, these were not included in the Google Maps. And I was surprised at how they were actually, the portal was put in about 2008. And the Google Maps images did not include that. So this is something that I think is really important with remote areas. And I think you have to understand that a lot of the map imaging that is out there is not going to be up to date. So you're going to have to accommodate that. In this instance, I was able to do that because I did have some access to some of the maps that the mining company had up on their website and also on some other sources. But I think it's something that you obviously need to keep in mind. In this particular instance, what it meant was I was going to have to do a very quick site survey, which to just coordinate with what I had versus what I didn't have. The next thing, obviously, that was obvious to this particular mission was that I was going to have to do on-the-ground meteorological readings. There simply was no facilities there for measuring weather. The closest aerodrome was La Belle-Saint-Quevillon, but I don't think I actually found anything that was being issued on. So I ended up having to look to Val d'Or to get my weather information. And then it was about 250 kilometers to the west of my location. Obviously, 250 kilometers can make a big difference.
Sure, easy 6, 7, 8 hours ahead of the time.
Exactly. So this is why I really did have to do on the ground measurements. Well, look to some further issues that I had to address and think about. All of you will know this, that keeping your flight batteries, your tablet, and your remote control batteries warm are really essential. So this is something that was, I knew this in advance before I started doing my research. I didn't have to really look. I obviously had to look for ways to mitigate this. I knew the problem was there. The most obvious thing is keeping your hands and the rest of your body warm. And again, if you've done any cold weather operations, it's astonishing how quickly your hands actually become almost a bit dumb. They're not quite as acute. Doing small tasks becomes difficult. So I had to keep my hands warm. And
I guess small tasks you take for granted, and then you're right there, and you can't turn this knob or this filter. You can't remove or.
Exactly right, and it's it actually goes beyond that. Obviously, just when you're using the sticks on a remote control, if your hands aren't behaving the way that you want, that's not good news. But definitely any tasks that are slightly complicated and that require a high degree of dexterity may be problematic. So you really do have to work at keeping your hands warm.
Did you feel rushed? Was weather a time pressure?
It was definitely hanging over me. I'll go in a little further into some depth about the rushed aspect of the first operation. The second operation which was much less rushed. I was rushed because when we arrived on the ground and we helicoptered in, we had to do both an on-the-ground site survey, which we did by truck, and also we did a helicopter site survey. So we essentially flew over the areas that we were going to be looking at to see how they would look. I was with my filmmaker colleague, and he wanted to see how this is going to look in video. That was obviously a very important aspect of what we were doing. So it was a combination of me looking at this from a practical perspective, and my colleague was looking at it from a more artistic perspective. The next thing that we had to that I had to consider, obviously, and the potential of extreme cold weather, snowfall, and the potential of icing conditions. So this was all a big question mark for me in advance. There were things that I obviously could do, but other things it was like you deal with it when it drops in your lap. Further issues to consider. I was operating this as like a dual role. I was both the pilot in command and the payload operator. My colleague was one of the visual observers. Ended up having a couple more as well. As you probably know, when you're doing everything at once, it's a bit of a challenge. You've got to keep track of both flying the aircraft and getting that great shot. So that's very important.
And what was the temperature when you landed?
Well, the temperature was actually it was less. It was above the minus 10. So it was not. It was about -8. I think we actually get into that a little bit later when I look more closely at the operation. But also another consideration you have to look at is the camera. What's the camera going to operate in? And I was using only an X3. I wasn't using an X5 in this. An X3 is good down to about 0 degrees Celsius. So obviously, if it's running colder than that, you may have some issues. You want to keep the camera warm. Another really big issue, and this is related to what you're outputting, what your product is the difficulty of actually shooting video in a snow-covered landscape. Cloudy skies, high ceiling, but very sort of muted light. But the actual snow was obviously very bright, and so you've really got to be somewhat experienced in dealing with something like that. It's not. It's definitely a lot different from dealing with a normal grass or even buildings, whatever. It's a lot of the recommendations that are out there about how to shoot in the snow, I found are probably not what you should use. And I was working with some post-production people who were quite experienced in how to shoot in those conditions. So pay attention to that, do some research, do some testing. Another issue that was up there, just there was no cellular service. So there was Wi-Fi when we were in the camp, but good side, obviously, I didn't have any interference in the wavelength that I was using on my remote. The bad aspect of obviously is you couldn't look something quickly up on your tablet or your iPhone. So that's a problem too. Okay, so the normal approach, or an approach to cold weather planning is you have to fit it into the terms of your SFOC. So obviously, I mean, I was somewhat restricted on that by the aircraft, but I didn't let it wildly affect what I was doing. As you'll see when we get into further into the operation, there was one day when we decided it was too cold to actually fly. The way that I looked at this, I considered Environment Canada historical weather records, and I looked from December right through to February rather, just to give you an idea of what I was dealing with. So the average mean temperature was -13 to -17 Celsius. So I knew it could be a little bit iffy there. Average monthly snowfall was between 50 and 52 centimeters. So that's every one of those 3 months an average, and an average of 15 snow days a year. So the chances were, as I was going into this, temperature is going to be beneath my minimum. I'm going to probably deal with a fair amount of snow, and guess what? It could have been snowing when I was actually doing the operation. Additional steps to planning. Let's look at those. Obviously, you want to collect as much information as you can. We all look to the internet, of course, and in fact, there's a list of websites that I consulted specifically about UAS operations. Keep in mind, of course, and as someone who is essentially a professional researcher, you've got to be sure of the data that you're getting off the internet. In some cases, it's anecdotal. It may not be proven. In some cases, it's just plain wrong. So be aware of that. You've got to have that filter whenever you're researching in the internet.
And that's why you're here with us tonight, right?
Exactly right. The next thing that I did was I used some of the more reliable sources that I would consider. So basically posted questions to colleagues in groups like the SFOC Canada Facebook group, several other ones. A number of those people I know and have conversations with over time. Some of them I know, in fact, have done winter operations. What I did was I posted very specific questions about equipment use, how to deal with cold weather operations, part of my research process. Next thing that I wanted to look to is what kind of equipment was I going to need? Was I going to need any new equipment? And in fact, there were some things that I had to buy, and there were some things that I had to actually make. I had to actually fabricate.
But flying in the helicopter, flying in, were you weight limited? Did they put any restriction on what you could bring?
There weren't. It was very interesting in a way because we flew up on a private a turboprop actually up to La Belle Cavillon. There was no restrictions. In fact, I think I need to fly this way all the time. It was actually a very nice and comfortable flight. We could take as much as we wanted. However, when we got to the helicopter, it was a little bit different. I can't remember the model of the helicopter. I think there were 5 of us in the helicopter. We couldn't keep certain equipment in the cockpit. There were storage areas at the sides. I'm going to raise this point a little bit later. In fact, those were not heated, which was problematic. I was able, for instance, to keep the things that I believed had to be kept at a good, reasonable temperature with me, but I couldn't put the drone into the cockpit. Another thing that you really want to consider doing is some advanced testing of your cold weather equipment in cold weather conditions. Unfortunately for me, November and December in Toronto was very mild. We had no snow, so I was essentially unable to do any real flight testing. If you get a chance to do it, take it for sure. For the February mission, it was quite different. I had some real winter in Toronto, and I was able to do some testing. Obviously, the normal equipment that you're going to use in any UAS flight operation for collecting video footage, you're going to work from checklists. I know you guys are all accustomed to working that way, but there obviously are some very specific needs that you're going to have to look at with a cold weather operation. First and foremost, I think, is like, in my case, it was a portable and flexible launch mat, something that I could take onto a helicopter. The reason for this is sort of obvious, but if you're on snow, you don't want to be landing or taking off, because as the props spin, it's going to draw particles of snow into the parts of the drone, and that's going to melt, and you're going to have a problem. So definitely have a good launching mat. An anemometer, and always tough for me to say that, but because I had to take account of the temperature and also the wind speed. So I have mine set in knots, which is the way I tend to think of things. In this particular instance, I knew that I was probably going to need a battery warmer. These do exist for Inspire ones. They also exist for Phantoms. They're relatively inexpensive. They're about $25 or $35. If you're flying an Inspire 2, you're not going to need them. I don't have an Inspire 2, but I know that there is a self-heating capacity with the batteries. They're actually quite an efficient way of heating the battery, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Because we're dealing with flight batteries, controller, you really have to think about keeping these things warm. So one of the first things that I had to figure out was, when I'm out doing the mission, how am I going to keep the batteries consistently warm? So what I ended up doing was researching. I needed a case that was portable and flexible, that was able to keep the batteries inside and keep them at a given temperature. I ended up buying it's like a thermal lunch case, fairly large one, and I lined it with space blanket to keep the warmth in. And I interleaved in some fabric between actually they were socks, don't tell anyone that, but I used socks the first time. Also, I would interleaving the batteries with some sort of fabric, wrapping them up in a space blanket, putting them into a thermal case to keep them warm. Now, I also, because I knew I was going to be dealing with some cold temperatures, I thought I would use some air-activated hand warmers, the batteries warm. And in Ontario, at least, the brand that is out there is called Grabber, but you can get them at Canadian Tire. You open them up, and they simply start to warm up, and they'll actually stay warm for about 6 hours. they're fantastic. I mean, they really are an interesting product. So what I did was I put those actually into the thermal case. So I was creating an environment that the batteries were going to stay warm. The next thing that I had to look at, and I knew this was a bit of a problem because I'd done some cooler weather operations, not as cold as this, using the tablet that I use in my operations, which is a mini iPad. I knew that there was some way I was going to have to keep this particular piece of equipment warm. So I did some research on what would work for that, and I found out that extruded polystyrene is an excellent way of insulating. In this particular instance, I repurposed it was a housing from a Parrot Bebop, one of my older drones. And what I did was I lined a space blanket sheet. You've got to remember to put it the right way. But I lined it with, and then put the iPad essentially into the combination space blanket and polystyrene housing. The idea with that is to keep it warm.
Did you have a generator?
I didn't. I was working because I was obviously helicoptering in. I had to work with what I brought in. What I used to keep my tablet fully charged was a power bank. If you don't have one of these, anyone who has tablets, I highly recommend them. They're very inexpensive. $30 or $40. Get at least I think a 16,000 milliamp per hour charger. Essentially, just plug it in anytime you're not using your particular your tablet. You will find in cold weather that the tablets lose their charge incredibly fast. The next thing I needed to look at was some touchscreen gloves, and again, these are obtainable on Amazon, or essentially close-fitting gloves that allow you to be quite dexterous, and then the fingertips on these particular gloves activate the touchscreen on your particular tablet.
Did you consider solar panels, portable or flexible solar panels?
I didn't, but that's a great idea. No, that was not. In fact, I'm not sure how effective they would have been it was not sunny, for any of the operations that we did. I don't know how effective they are in cloudy conditions. Perhaps they are. I don't know.
And if they're flexible and it's really cold, they could even eventually crack, I guess.
It's possible. As I said, I think a good solution is one of these power banks. There's a whole series of them out there. They're inexpensive. They're light. I've used them when I've gone on trips, when I've needed to keep either a tablet or a phone charged. I think they're so inexpensive and light. They're really worth investing in.
Did you feel you were well dressed?
I think I did. I tried. Obviously, I had the touchscreen gloves, which kept your hands to some degree warm. But I used large-sized over mittens that I put on, and then I would put some of the hand warmers into the mittens. So the idea was I was obviously trying to keep my hands warm. Layered extreme weather clothing is what you need for this type of operation. Workwear and technical wear is really worth considering. I've had a lot of luck with. I'm doing commercials here with Helly Hansen workwear, very well made, and I've also bought other things from Mountain Equipment Co-op. Again, this is more technical wear. These things layered, light, they keep you warm, and if you need more, you obviously put more on. Okay, so let's work on to have a look at the actual flight operation. This was December, and it was only a half-day operation, which was very, very tight. So we were flying in and out by helicopter on the same day. My colleague ended up staying. He was doing some additional work. We were, in essence, going in with investors. That's why we went in by helicopter, and we ended up flying out. We were in 9 o'clock or so, or 9:30, and then we were basically back on the helicopter at noon to fly out. So it was a very restricted time on this particular operation.
Now that seems to me to be a very small window for you to deploy and first visit on site as well. So you had to get acquainted with the area, no?
It was difficult. We ended up having to do a final site survey by helicopter. We flew over and had a look at what we wanted to film. We drove around in a truck, had a look at the features. It was a very tight time frame, and this is something that I would really emphasize to people, that if you're squished into a very tight time frame, it is going to be difficult. It is going to be a challenge. You really need to have some extra time to plan, to deploy and to obviously execute the mission. So yeah, if you're doing it in a few hours, I would say think twice about it. Try and give yourself some extra time on that. Let's have a quick review of what the conditions were. So it was -8, so definitely within my window. Not as cold as -10, which was my cutoff point to some degree. Cloudy, no precipitation, which was great. The winds were very gentle, only 5 knots coming from the northwest. There was about 7 to 10 centimeters of snow on the ground, so absolutely snow as expected. We'll move on to the actual operation. I activated the hand warmers and I dropped them into the overmitts, and that was to keep my hands nice and toasty and warm. And then I put the additional activated hand warmers, and again, you just tear them open and then put them in, and they heat up. Shut the lid. I wanted to make sure that I was creating a warm environment. I wanted to keep those batteries warm, and I wanted also to keep my remote warm. So
your warm box was like a cooler, like a summer cooler we use for picnics? Or?
It was. It was like, but this was a flexible one that because I knew I was traveling in conditions where I might have to compress things. It was a larger cooler would be ideal in my opinion. And in fact, if I had been driving in by vehicle, my own vehicle, I think I would have used one of those, which I have. You could absolutely again line it with a space blanket. And put your batteries in with the activated hand warmers. This was a smaller one. I needed to keep it small, and it was a flexible one. But it did in fact.
But the larger they are, the more difficult they are to keep warm, though.
I'm not entirely sure of that. I've read some accounts that suggest that like a large sized cooler is not a bad way to store batteries. So again, I think the idea is if you kept them warm, or you put the hand warmers in advance, and I'll get into this a little bit later. What it does is it almost creates a small atmosphere, and it keeps the temperature quite steady, and you keep the lid shut, obviously. Before each particular flight, then I was placing each battery into the DJI warmer unit. 15 minutes on, so basically what you do is you drop it into the warmer, and then you push you activate the battery, and then you leave it in for 15 minutes, and it gently warms the battery up, and then you turn it off for 5 minutes, but you leave it in the battery. So obviously ran the drone off the launch mat, and I ran it for about 1 minute in advance to warm things up just before I took off. Now, the DJI Go app actually does indicate to you if the temperature is at a safe level for flight. That's actually 20 degrees Celsius with the batteries for the Inspire 1. You will find, however, that some of the other apps that you may want to use don't have that capacity. I often use Litchi, and the Litchi app does not tell you. So you're going to want to either activate the DJI Go app to see your temperatures, or obviously you're going to feel if the batteries are warm, and you can tell pretty quickly. Hover check, so you do that anyway, of course, but you're going to extend it once you're up in the air, whatever, 5 or so meters, 10 meters, and run it for 1 or 2 minutes to warm things up. It boosts the battery temperature up, and then you want to be very easy on the control sticks when you're starting off.
What else did you do to get ready just before taking off?
Well, obviously the tablet, which is important, went into its polystyrene housing.
Now, the tablet, was the screen covered as well, or just the underneath?
Yeah, the screen was not covered, just the back of it essentially. I didn't cover that. And in retrospect, I think you really have to think about keeping the whole unit warm. In my opinion, and I'll probably come back to this a couple of times, I think the weakest link in the chain is in fact your tablet. They lose power so quickly, they cool off so much. The drone does, and its batteries do a lot better than the tablet. I don't think I'm not sure. I was using as Apple products. I'm not sure if there's any difference with Android products. Recharging the battery the tablet rather, with the power bank between each flight. So essentially, what you're seeing is in extreme cold weather is the battery is in the tablet is dropping rapidly.
But the power bank, was it cold as well?
No, the power bank was okay. It's funny, I didn't actually deal with where to keep the power bank. It seemed I must have just had it in
your pockets, your coat?
I don't remember, to be honest. It's a good question, but you probably would want to keep it warm, I would say. That would make sense. But whenever I was finished a flight, I would automatically just plug it in to boost the charge up on the tablet. As I said, weakest link in the chain for sure.
So how many flights did you do that day?
Well, we only did 4 flights. It was fairly rapid. We went to several locations, I think 3 locations, and be careful that you don't go below 30% on your battery warning. It didn't happen to me, but I've heard people or I've read accounts on the internet suggesting that it can really drop fast.
So the flights are completed, and now it's time to assess how satisfied you were of the operation.
Exactly, Jean. This is my after the operation look at how successful the equipment was, how successful I was. It's obviously important in any operation, I think, but in this particular situation more. So the battery thermal case, it really worked pretty well, I thought, quite adequately. It wasn't perfect. The batteries were a little bit cooler than anticipated when they came out of the case. Fortunately, I had the Inspire 1 battery warmer, which works remarkably well. It is, however, time consuming. You have to coordinate using the battery warmer with your flights. It's good to have one battery in the drone and the next one in the battery warmer ready to come up and use the next time. The consumption of the battery is minimal, reported as being about 3% from my research. I would agree with that. It was in my eyes, the battery warmers have a very gentle draw. They really do not impact the flight time at all.
How were the flight controls and the camera controls?
Well, the flight controls were actually okay, not a problem. However, I did find that the gimbal pitch and yaw was a little bit on the sluggish side in that particular operation. I didn't realize it at the time what caused it, but I figured out probably what it was is the trip from Labelle, CQFA to the actual mine site. The case for the Inspire was with the gimbal was in an unheated compartment. So you may want to make sure that you keep your gimbal and camera in warm conditions also. Another thing that I really found was problematic was the ND filters that I was using were very difficult to change because the ND filter would contract onto the threads of the camera, and it was like it was fused onto the camera. It was really, and then your hands are a little bit on the cold side, and if you're wearing gloves, you really can't get a good purchase on these. That was, for me, problematic, and I got to solve that one.
Were the threads kind of oily or dry?
They weren't. I didn't really think about this at all. It was something that I basically discovered. I was able to solve it. I think, I don't know, you may want to bring a pair of rubber gloves. You know, sometimes if you have to open a jar or something, you can't get a good purchase on it. I mean, I think that would have worked, but basically don't screw them on too tightly. They're probably between flights, they're not going to vibrate off. So just make sure you don't give them that extra turn. Also, the tablet really lost power way faster than I thought. And I'm going to keep coming back to this because I think I see a good post there actually about putting some oil on the actual threads. I think that's a great point, Mario. Thanks very much for posting that.
Or WD-40 perhaps not something too thick. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, it was something that I didn't think of at the time. In retrospect, I mean, the way that as we'll come back to it, the way that I solved it was I just didn't put them on too tight for the next one. It just sort of just turned them to the point where they started to bite, and then I left them there. And then between every flight, I would just check to make sure that it wasn't vibrating off. So even with the gloves and the mitts on, I found that my hands really got cold. And I really think that you've got to pay some extra attention to keeping your hands warm. So just keep that in mind. One of the other things that, again, wasn't obvious to me, but it really sort of popped up during the operation, is if you're using a long connector between the tablet and the remote, it really can get get in the way, and it becomes like a big stiff piece of spaghetti, really difficult to handle, to get out of the way. The cold weather obviously makes it stiffer. I was finding sometimes it was actually popping out of the, can't remember whether it was from, I think it was popping out of the remote. And it was, so that's something that keep in mind. A big issue. The half-day mission envelope, way too rushed in retrospect. If you're doing something like this, make sure that you've got more time than half a day.
Did you feel that the people around you were also cold and kind of rushing you, or not exactly be patient enough?
There was that aspect as well. We knew that we had to get out of there by noon, so there was basically a bit of a rushed feel to it. I think it's hard to actually contest that when you're in the situation. You just want to do your best.
In retrospect, would you have briefed them differently?
I think I would have. I think it's a good idea to manage their expectations in advance. I think advise that certain operations.
In the UAV human factors course, we talk a lot about the briefing and, taking care of people around us to make sure that we're all on the same page. I guess you identify that as an important feature.
I do think it is, Jean. I mean, obviously the people around me were sort of looking to me as I was the PIC, and they were following my lead. But the fact that we had that very narrow envelope of time was an overriding factor. And I think I probably responded in a rushed way because I felt that we had to get things done quickly. So
it's also the shortest daytime of the year. Helicopter is not night rated per se, this operation, so the pilot had to leave the mine area before dusk.
Yeah, in this case we obviously only left at 12, but that definitely is a factor, I would think. Obviously, if you were in the further north, I would think that would really be an issue you would have to think about.
So the equipment you basically have to live with, but the procedures all around that could, I guess in retrospect, you could have adapted better?
I could have, and this obviously was the first part of the operation. It wasn't as if I had been on site before. I had a tight time envelope. I hadn't been able to do my advanced testing because I didn't have any cold weather, and I felt a little bit rushed. So yeah, these are factors I think that you really need to consider.
Did you include your partners, your filming partners in your appraisal, or this is personal notes you took?
These are personal notes. They pretty much would follow my lead, and I tell them, which is handy. Although also when you're working with a filmmaker, do be aware sometimes that they will push envelopes with you.
Now, I guess everybody learned from it, and you ended up going back a couple of months later, right?
We did. And initially, I mean, that was, I think part of the plan was that there was going to be multiple trips. My colleague stayed on for a couple of days, but then there were some interviews he had to do, and then we wanted to get some additional aerials. So yes, we were going back in February. And
not necessarily because it was a failure, it's because they learned as well as with you, and they wanted more, right?
Exactly. And there was more to be done as well. So we used the very, very narrow time frame that I had with the helicopter to get in for the first time. It worked out great because it gave me the chance to have a look at the situation, have a look at the ground, get a handle on what would be required for further operations. And in fact, at this time, we didn't know that it was going to be in February, but we had 3 days scheduled in February. So we were doing 2 nights staying over in the exploration camp. Instead of traveling in by helicopter this time, we actually we flew into La Aviation, and then we took a truck in. So it was about a 1.5 to 2 hour drive. With respect to this mission, pretty much the same as far as planning the flights regarding the SFOC, so that was not particularly different in this particular instance. However, there were some modifications that I wanted to make from my learning experience that I had in the first particular mission. And one of the modifications was I wanted to improve the thermal case that I was using. And the way that I did this was by taking additional layers of the space blanket and putting them in. So I was again making a sort of a better environment to retain the heat. I actually used thicker cloths as well. So I really swaddled these batteries in cloth, and I think I might have put in a couple of extra activated hand warmers as well.
But did you benefit from the winter months at home before going back, or were you determined to polish your procedures at home before going?
Absolutely, and because it was now winter, real winter in Toronto, I was definitely able to both think about this and also to test and try some things out. I did some further research too. Let's look at the actual planning going in further. We've got an extra layer of additional space blanket was added to this polystyrene tablet housing. My theory was there would be additional retention of heat. They said this was definitely the loosest, or the weakest link in the chain. I decide now this next thing is great, and I got this from next point is great, and I got this from someone on the I think the SFOC Canada page, and what he uses is the activated warmers on the back of the tablet, and I thought I went and I looked at the actual hand warmers, and they were actually too thick to do that, but they have these great adhesive foot warmers, which I ended up trying too on my feet.
You can get the whole sole. I mean,
this was in this instance it was just maybe about 2 inches by about maybe an inch or so, something like that. Same thing, you open the package up, and then unlike the hand warmers, there's adhesive on this. So what you can do is you can actually put it on the back of the tablet. So that was my plan, to put these, activate them, put them on the back of the tablet housing, and then put the tablet over top. And remember, there's a space blanket here, and there's the polystyrene housing. So what I'm doing is I'm at the back of it anyway, creating an environment to keep the heat in. The hand warmers, I thought I'm going to put them in advance instead of at the last minute. I would say put them in at least a half an hour before the actual flights.
A good trick for those pads is even the same thing when you go skiing, is not to apply them on cold feet, is to start with warm equipment and it will keep warm. If you realize too late and then you stick your pad warmer on a cold device, it might not be powerful to bring back the temperature, but it's great to keep it warm.
Yeah, that makes real sense. And it's interesting that on the flight back, the first time we were chatting with several of the people, there were some geologists there, and they were talking about the way they used these hand and foot warmers when they were doing drilling rigs in their work in mines. So these are great devices. I highly recommend them. Probably one of the most useful pieces of equipment that I used in the second operation were the DJI insulated battery stickers. They are sort of like pieces of foam, I suppose, that are cut to the shape of the actual battery, peel off the foam, and then you apply them to either side of the battery. And I just read that these might work, and in fact, they really did work, and I'll go into that later. So anyway, that was something that I decided to try, and they actually ended up working quite nicely. I was going to use the same battery warmer. I knew that it worked well, and I knew that it would heat up the batteries if the insulated battery stickers didn't work. So that was a backup, and I did end up using it. The next thing, of course, obviously, I needed to make sure that I kept the gimbal and the camera warm. I just made sure. Obviously, I wasn't traveling by helicopter in this instance, but I just made sure that I kept it warm.
Well, I guess there's a concern there that you get condensation when you go from a fairly warm environment to a cold environment. Did you observe some condensation in the camera, for example?
I didn't actually see that. I know people have spoken of this, and I would say that would be a concern. I think some people have talked about putting those desiccated pads into if you've got an environment where there might be condensation to prevent the condensation forming. I'm not really sure how effective those are. I'd be interested if anyone has had any experience with that. I didn't actually notice that was a particular problem in my instance.
If you don't swallow them, they're pretty good.
I guess so. Activated hand warmers. Use them beyond the drone. Use them for yourself. I just put a couple inside of the pockets of my parka. Quick hit of some heat. Your hands get cold and stiff and everything. Put your hands into and grab onto these things. They work great.
And you can buy them bulk on online Asian sites.
They're quite inexpensive, even at Canadian Tire. I mean, they're really not a lot of money at all, so well worth it. So yeah, I would say, if you're going to do some winter operations, just buy a whole bunch of packages of these particular activated hand warmers. The next thing, instead of using that long cord connecting the remote to the tablet, just get a short lightning cord. You can get them like 3 or 4 inches. They're pretty much out of the way, and obviously you're not going to end up knocking these things out. So that was what I used in this. I wanted to use in this particular instance. The next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to make sure that I kept all the components of the operation inside a truck during the operation instead of keeping it outside. I just wanted to keep everything warm if I could.
Now, this time your scenario was over several days, right?
I had a lot more time to plan, to tell people what to do, to organize things. And it was, by comparison to the first operation, it was pretty much a breeze. It was, I was really able to do everything more thoroughly, I think. So the first day that we arrived, it was cold. It was about it varied between about minus 25 and minus 28. I remember when we got out of the aircraft, the first thing I noticed was my legs were stinging.
Well, this is barbecue temperature in Saguenay, you know?
The day, a couple of days prior, the pilots who flew in said it had been minus 50 Celsius. So this is a cold place. When we arrived, it was minus 28, sunny, minimal winds. Because of the SFOC and because of the UA's specs, we decided not to initiate a mission on that day. We had other things to do, which actually worked out well, and we ended up actually going into the mine, which was most interesting for me. We did some interviews down in the mine.
What is warmer as you went down? Was the mine fairly mild?
It was quite mild down there. It was. We were wrapped up. We were wearing mining helmets with lights, and we had these jackets and pants and boots. Like we were really wrapped up, but it wasn't cold at all. And strangely, it wasn't claustrophobic. It was actually quite a high ceiling, maybe 20, 25 feet up, with metal screening over, pitch black, of course, when you go down. I had no idea that they didn't light every aspect of a mine shaft, but they don't. So we went in for went down about 150 meters. And then we went in, I think, about maybe 2 kilometers down a drift. And we went actually right down to the mine face. And then we did some interviews down there.
So at the surface, minus 28, did you go flying anyway outside of parameters? Or how do you handle extreme cold temperature?
In that particular instance, I just decided to respect the SFOC, respect the aircraft. And I knew that we had 2 other days. And also there was a warming trend coming. So it worked out really well. The idea was we would look at it the next day, see how it played out. The warming trend, in fact, continued during the night, and it rose, according to the information we were getting, was supposed to rise to about minus 10 in the morning. So we were optimistic that we could start the next day early and have operational temperatures.
So you decided to wait instead of crashing your UAV.
We decided to wait, and then took a tour of a golden. So it was an interesting experience.
Did you pick up a few pebbles?
I did, and it was sort of interesting because one of the geologists, in fact, chipped off with her hammer a chunk of rock. It was maybe 5 or 6 inches wide, and then she looked at it with a loop, and then she told us the various minerals that were in the piece of rock, and then she said, oh yeah, there's about 1 gram of gold in this particular rock. Wow. So pretty rich mine, and this is why they're as I said, they have 45 drilling rigs. They really do think something's going to. Second day, we ended up doing a full day operation. It was overcast. There was no precipitation at all. Temperature was great. It was about minus 7, and it was in fact rising. Fairly gentle winds. It was I measured about 6 knots, and we had snow on the ground, maybe 5, maybe a bit more than that. So we ended up doing a full day. Day 3 was only to be a half-day operation because we had to head back. It worked out really well because there was actually some precipitation that was about to come in about noon, and in fact it ended up being icing conditions, and we couldn't in fact fly out of La Belle-sur-Quévillon because they didn't have de-icing equipment there. We ended up having to bus all the way to Val d'Or.
So in retrospect, how did the second mission work?
The second mission worked really, really well. I mean, again, we're going to go through a sort of an appraisal process, based on the mistakes that I made in the first mission and the things that I learned, I was able to pick up some valuable knowledge. So we made sure that all the gear was stored in the trucks during the flight. So we kept equipment warm. That was important. UAS and all the gear was stored at an indoor staging point when we could get it in. Like for instance, at lunch on day 2, we took it into a warm room and we didn't wrap it up or anything. We just kept it in the room, warmed up the equipment. I was also able to do some battery charging there. The modifications to the thermal case and the activation of the hand warmers worked really successfully. The batteries were warm all the time. I had no indications at all that we were running with cold batteries. It was a successful point there. So the longer multi-day flight operation really did allow for more preparation time between flights. I was able to think about things a lot more. I was able to plan them. I didn't feel that I was hurried. This is one of the central points here. If you're working in a cold weather operation, make sure that you've got the time to do it. The DJI battery installation stickers were a real success. I really believe in these things. I think there was only maybe once or twice that I actually had to heat a battery up. And so these things are really successful. They maintain the temperature. They don't look like anything. They just look like, as I said, stickers that are on the side of the batteries, but they in fact do work quite nicely.
And how did your strategy with your tablet work out?
It worked out very successfully. The actual tablet did not lose the charge as quickly. So the hand warmers on the back of the tablet kept the temperature up, and as a result, the charge was not being lost. Also, the extra space blanket helped to keep the environment warm. So very successful. The short lightning cable that worked very well as well. It didn't get pulled, unlike the larger one, wasn't pulled out of the remote, and didn't get in my way. And I didn't have this long stiff piece of spaghetti. It worked very successfully. The battery warmer, again, these I think these are fantastic. They work really well. This is the actual device. A question there about removing the stickers afterwards. I didn't actually. In fact, they're still on right now. Of course, in Toronto we have winter. No, I didn't take them off. Those have stayed on, and it is possible to actually pull those stickers off. I'm not sure how successful that would be. I think I'll bet if you pulled them off, they would probably curl or there'd be a bit of a problem. But I've left them on, and my theory is that if you're running operations during the winter, I would just leave them on. They're quite inexpensive too. So, but the battery warmer is a good backup. As I said here, I only used it once or twice. I don't remember. It works well. It is time consuming. You've got to build that in. You've got, as I said, with the Inspire one, you're looking at 15 minutes and then 5 minutes. So it's 20 minutes. So you've got to build that into your flight time.
And the camera gimbal was reactive normally?
No issues at all with the camera and the gimbal. Very successful. So keeping it warm is important. And then we have the ND filters. I had screwed them on quite loosely. Again, very successful. I didn't have any problems with changing them. I had to change them a couple of times. Hand warmers in the parka pockets were great too. I just put my hands in to the pockets, quick heat. But again, like my identification is of the tablet being a problem, cold hands another problem. You've got to really think about that a lot.
Now it seems that you learned a lot. In retrospect, after those 2 missions, what would you change? What would be your future modification?
Well, I obviously thought about it a lot, and I considered what I had done. I did a little bit of further research. I know that the transmitter mitts, they're called, are something that if you were dealing with windy conditions, you might want to put one of those over top of your transmitter, your remote rather. I think there are some problems with those. They look a little bit awkward, and I heard actually yesterday someone saying that they can steam up because they have a plastic window over the top, so you're looking down and through this plastic, so that could be a problem. But definitely it could keep your hands warm from wind.
Yeah, they had quite a few issues with those in CED Alma and cold temperature BVLOS trials, and it's dealing with get moisture, in fact.
Right. So I'm not sure. Again, like you might be able to modify the housing for the tablet so that it wouldn't steam up. I'm not quite sure.
I was thinking of those spray-on anti-fog you put on your regular glasses. Perhaps you could. Must be an oily substance that you spray on.
That would be a possibility
or
too.
dish soap, perhaps.
Yeah, you might want to try that. Yeah. It just makes it look a little bit unwieldy. There's one of the people on the Facebook groups talked about battery warmed gloves. I've never tried them, but I thought that might be something worth thinking about. The one thing that I've really thought a lot about, and unfortunately they're very expensive, is the DJI Crystal Sky monitor. And apparently it's good to -20, and it's about 2 or 3 times as bright as any tablet, and it looks very robust. However, do you want to pay $1,000 for a tablet? And plus, you can't run anything other than DJI apps on it. You couldn't run Lychee, or you couldn't run other apps. So,
or if you stay long enough in the gold mine, perhaps.
Well, perhaps I should have been filling my pockets, I guess. Yeah. Mindset is incredibly important. A lot of people just don't think you can run a cold weather operation. Well, they're wrong. You can. Within defined limits, it's totally possible. So I think don't defeat yourself before you start.
That's a great message.
One of the other things that really came through in my experience was the enhanced importance of any planning that you do. Anyone we know who's planning flight operations is doing a lot of planning. Well, just add another couple of layers of planning. It's important that you do it, and think about what you're doing, plan in advance, test your equipment. It's really crucial to have the right gear and equipment, and I would say it's really crucial to test it. If you're cold, you're going to be incredibly miserable and preoccupied with your own freezing cold hands or your freezing cold feet. Make sure that you're really adequately dressed. My son, who's worked up in Alaska and in Yellowknife, has always told me most people who are dealing with cold weather in southern parts of Canada just never dress properly. He said that if you dress adequately, if you dress professionally for what you're doing, you're not going to be cold. You're not going to have that discomfort factor. You're not going to be preoccupied.
And your mind will stay on the flight instead of on fighting the cold.
Exactly. You don't want to be sort of dealing with discomfort issues. Special attention to those hands. You've got to keep them warm, and remember that once they start to get a little on the cold side, they're not flexible. They're not going to do what you want them to do, and you can't afford to do that when you're handling the control stick on a drone. And if you're taking batteries out, and if you're changing lenses, you're not going to be able to do that. Keep your hands warm. The tablets really are the weakest part of. You've got to make sure that you keep them really warm. Experiment with that. Make sure you keep them charged. You really have to pay attention to them because they're going to be a problem. Do your testing in advance. I mean, if you have the cold weather, get out there. I do my testing at a MAC club between the first operation and the second operation, and then even afterwards. I'm often the only person there on a weekend. I'm standing out there. In fact, it's funny because the flight club has something in early January they call the Frozen Fingers flight. It's like the one day that the club members come out and actually will do some cold weather operations. I'm there every weekend. It doesn't matter what kind of weather it is. The colder the better, because it's really helped me get good at doing this. Except that the weather conditions are possibly going to necessitate you canceling your UAV operation. It could happen. The first day that I arrived in the February trip was simply too cold. So you have to deal with the weather, and sometimes that is going to mean postponing or canceling. You really need to convey to your clients that this is a possibility, and sometimes this is a difficult pill for them to swallow. So you've got to make sure that they have a realistic overview. UAV operations in cold weather conditions are not the same as getting out in the middle of the summer. They're different. They're more trying. You may have to cancel flight operations. You may have to postpone. Things are going to be slowed down. You're going to actually need to have some extra time for anything that you do.
There is a concern, Stephen, about about moving from heated environment to the cold between missions. You say you didn't feel any.
I didn't find that. As I said, I think probably what happened when, as I said, on day 2, we stored the drone inside one of the storage buildings, and it was heated. I didn't find there was a particular issue in this instance. I know that others have pointed out that this can be a problem. So I didn't actually see any frost on the lenses. It didn't happen. Can imagine when you have something approximating icing conditions that could happen, but then you probably shouldn't be flying if that's actually what you're dealing with. So if it seemed to be clear, I was okay. When I was taking off and landing, I had my launch mat down, and as a result, I wasn't getting any snow that was or frost that was being kicked up in front of the lens.
Stephen, I can't thank you enough coming from Toronto for this. You were so generous, so clear in your message. What I've kept in your message is planning, be ready and have fun.
It's true. Planning, absolutely. Just take the professionalism that you've learned in your courses here. And I think attitude, important. These cold weather missions are totally possible. Get out there and practice. I think they're worth doing, and there might be I think there's a whole niche of UAV flight operations that most people just steer away from. Not me. I'm going to go out and get those cold weather operations.
That concludes our meeting with Toronto-based operator Stephen Sweeting of DroneVue Imaging on cold temperature RPAS operations. Join us soon for another webinar, and goodbye.